Many of you know Nancy Spanis, our speaker today. And for those of you who do not, she's a retired journalist and editor whose study of Alexander Hamilton began all the way back in the 1970s. So she's been playing with this for the better part of half a century. In 1977, she co-edited The Political Economy of the American Revolution, a collection of economic writings which influenced and reflected the American system. If you don't know what the American system is, I'm gonna bet you're about to find out. That is something near and dear to Loudoun's heart because it's something we cared about, and it's not necessarily something that's gone. In 2017, she started a blog, American System Now, and in 2019, published Hamilton versus Wall Street, the core principles of the American system of economics. Well, glory, that's a lesson to all of us, isn't it now? Except now I can't see it, so I'm going to just make up stuff from here on in. For many years, she worked at Walt Disney. I'm kidding. Actually, Nancy is an active member of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, the Daughters of the American Revolution. She's an adjunct professor teaching classes on the American system at Shepherd University over in Jefferson County and also on Long Island University. She finds time to manage the Western Loudoun Food Pantry housed at New Jerusalem Lutheran Church locally. She's a graduate of Bryn Mawr, has her master's from Columbia, and lives with her brilliant husband, Ed. Did you write this? On the main street of Lovettsville. And of course, she's an active member of the Lovettsville Historical Society. This is a program we've been waiting a long time to hear because here's the thing. You hear about federalism, you hear about Hamilton. Now and again, you hear about the American system. James Monroe, for example, a supporter of same, was from here, at least for part of his life at Oak Hill, south of Leesburg. So what we would think about at this point is, let's discover the connections between these things and our own dear Loudoun. Here's Nancy Spanis.
Okay. We okay here? Everybody? Whoops. This still says, are we being recorded? Okay. Okay. So a little bit about the background of this particular lecture and the study. As my book came out in 2019, when it finally got to 2020, I said, I have to give a lecture at the Loudoun, for the Historical Society. It's a prestigious group, they get a lot of people. I'd like to do that. And the board said, well, that's fine, but why don't you come up with a local angle? We don't want to just hear what everybody else hears. You gave a book signing, so come up with a local angle. And I was a little bit flummoxed by this because as far as I know, the only time Alexander Hamilton was in Virginia was at Yorktown, where he did heroic work. But other than that, he didn't work here. And in fact, the capital didn't move to Washington until he was out of government. So I had to do a little digging. And to my surprise, I'll tell you what I found. So I've studied Hamilton for quite some time. The other thing that affected me was the fact that that his vision for the United States was actually quite different from the general vision from Virginia. He founded an American system of economics, which was intended to defend the independence that we had won, to give us economic independence along with political independence. And that meant to him, we had to develop manufacturing. And we had to therefore have a source of credit that would permit people to go into manufacturing. We had, this is Paterson, New Jersey, by the way, which he founded by establishing the Society for Useful Manufactures. It's in the 20th century. There aren't many pictures of Paterson, New Jersey back there in the 1790s, but when it was founded in 1791. However, so his concept was, in order to defend our independence and prosper, you know, we were in an imperial world, you may recall, and they hadn't left. The British were still in their forts, and the French were still an active force. The Spanish, not so much, but you know, they were still an empire. So we had to have our independence. That meant economic independence. It meant credit. It meant an active government to support that credit. It meant infrastructure, transportation, and it meant a workforce, you know, a population that was educated to be able to do that. Because to do that, you really needed to use the inventiveness of the mind of your population, because your wealth, from Hamilton's standpoint and the school that he comes from, does not really depend on how much gold you have in the ground or how much coal you have in the ground or how sharply you can trade, you know, versus other countries. It depends upon whether you can come up with new inventions. It depends upon your ability to innovate, create resources, actually, where they didn't exist before, create machines to implement those resources. So that was a concept he put out in the report on manufactures and attempted to go as far as he could in his years in the Treasury Department to be able to implement. This is one of the expressions of his view that actually is in the report on manufacturers, which is his major writing on his vision. It's the basis for my book, which is over there, Hamilton versus Wall Street, which I encourage you to look at. And it expresses that concept that I said. We shouldn't have to be dependent on the whims of an imperial power if for the essentials of life and for the essentials of progress. Now, that, of course, was an idea that was supported by a resident of Northern Virginia, George Washington, and that was extremely important. And he himself had quite a vision of unifying the country with infrastructural developments, such as making the Potomac navigable all the way to the west. What they were worried about at that point, Hamilton and Washington, was uniting the country east to west, not north-south. It wasn't a north-south idea. And the idea that Hamilton was not interested in agricultural development is just not true. It was agro-industrial. Manufacturers would enhance your agriculture and would in fact provide a market, a domestic market for your agriculture, as opposed to having to send stuff overseas, wait for the money. Does it happen or not? Do they need it or not? You know, it'll happen right here. So, however, there was opposition to this view, as you're probably aware, and that opposition was centered right here in Virginia with Mr. Jefferson. And his view was, no, we really don't want to have those dirty manufacturers. The people who work the soil are the soul of our country, and let the manufacturers remain in Europe. And that was my thought of what Virginia was all about, with some exceptions, John Marshall, George Washington, and people of that sort. But when I started looking into it, what I discovered is that Loudoun County, of all places, was a Federalist stronghold, Federalists being those who subscribed to many of Hamilton's ideas. It's not a total equivalent to look at Hamilton and federalism, because there were aspects of the Federalist Party which Hamilton absolutely opposed, and they opposed him. But in general, Loudoun, combined with some of the major cities, Alexandria, Richmond, the Norfolk area, were the places where the Federalists were popular. Now, and then you look around and you see evidence of Federalist activity all around. Middleburg, established by the guy who was the founder of federalism in Loudoun County, Leven Powell. You have Aldie Mill, whose manager we have here with us today, which was established by Federalist Charles Mercer. Both of those gentlemen were in the House of Delegates and the Congress. Mercer for decades, a very significant force nationally. Leven Powell more in Virginia itself. You have Little River Turnpike. Actually, I thought he founded it. He didn't really found it, but he founded he fought for the precursor, which went bankrupt, and then contributed to building that as a source of taking food and products to market, because there was tremendous desire on the part of the farmers in this area to find a way to engage in commerce, because they didn't really have a navigable river. The river was not navigable all the way. So they wanted roads. They wanted a source of credit. They wanted banks. They wanted some attention paid to their infrastructure. And the House of Delegates was pretty much controlled by the plantation elite, and they not only controlled the voting, they controlled the money. They didn't want to be taxed to provide these public improvements. So they made sure that there was less representation from places like Loudoun County and further west. I mean, remember, I think when I looked up yesterday, 50 counties seceded when West Virginia was formed. Those 50 counties were all part of Virginia, and they were part of what was largely unrepresented in the House of Delegates and in the activity. So the people out here really wanted to have economic development. They didn't want to just, stick to their particular farms and be self-sufficient. There were, also ideological reasons for some, Quakers, and so forth. And then the last evidence of Federalist influence, which is obviously quite important, is the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which was another version of George Washington's Potomac dream. So this evidence really pointed me to two leading people, who is what I wrote about in an article that I did that's on the website of the Historical Society, I think from May of 2020, and then is also in the Bulletin of Loudoun County History. But I recommend you go to the real thing, which is the book. But if you're interested in history here, that'll give you a little bit more than I'll give you. So I'm going to give you a profile of the two guys who really came as close as possible that I know of to representing this Hamiltonian view here in Loudoun. So Leven Powell, neither of these guys were born in Loudoun. I mean, they came from somewhere else in Virginia. And Powell was really a all-around participant in building this nation. This is the plaque that they have for him down in Middleburg. And I'll give you a little bit more of an idea of what he actually did. I'm not going to ask you to read these whole details, but he was a signer of the Loudoun Resolves. He was a member of the Committee of Safety. So very early on, you know, what was happening with the Loudoun Resolves in 1774, you may recall, was a mobilization of all the colonies behind Boston, which was the front line fighting the British impositions at that time, which did include, over the course of time, a refusal to allow the colonies to manufacture. People underestimate the role that the economic development impulse of the colonists who came here was being thwarted by the British. But there were, you know, you couldn't make finished iron products, you couldn't make finished hats, you couldn't have your own currency, etc. These were all factors that went into the confrontation. Hamilton himself said it. If someone thinks this is just about a little tax, they're really crazy. You know, it's not just about a tax. So anyway, the Loudoun Resolves, I think, was prior to the Fairfax Resolves, which would know better, and then moving into the First Continental Congress for a united front in support of Boston and moving toward independence. So he was a signer. Some say he was an author of that particular document. And then he joined the military. He was a friend of George Washington. He was particularly asked by George Washington first, you know, to get involved in the military. And he ended up at Valley Forge. He got very sick. I think he left the military in 1779, but he was there in the thick of it for a significant part of the time. And then in 1779 to 93, he was elected to the House of Delegates from here as a Federalist. There were obviously others, well, actually not a Federalist yet, excuse me. Federalists don't really exist until the ratifying process for the Constitution. But as a proto-nation builder, there he was elected. He was on the board of Washington's Potomac Company, which was established in the 1780s prior to the Constitution in the attempt to make navigable the river to areas further west, both for their commerce and political unity. In 1787, he establishes Middleburg. It already is a community run by a fellow by the name of Chin. So the inn, which is the picture, I mean, there are pictures of the street and so forth and so on. But this is what he establishes. And then he's one of two Loudoun delegates to the Virginia Ratification Convention. Now that is significant. At that point, of course, the unity behind independence is beginning to split, and you have people who are very wary of having a national government, and and are fearful, and you have the people who understand that you need to have a national government with certain powers in order to defend our independence. So there's one delegate is anti-constitution and one delegate is for. The delegate for is Leven Powell, and he does speak up at that at the ratification convention. And it's a dicey event, as I think sort of reflected in this painting. But we make it. It passes. He supported then one of Hamilton's controversial proposals for establishing our economic independence, the first bank of the United States. And, you know, that required a lot of argument and defense. Jefferson thought it was terrible because it was consolidating power and giving too much power to those in the national government. And he actually said those who support it should get the death penalty. But he wasn't in power at that time, so it didn't happen. In the course of the 1790s, you have another conflict as the situation with France is heating up, as Napoleon has taken over, the Alien and Sedition Acts are passed to deal with unrest between those who are opposing more federal control and those. It all sounds like nothing changes, but everything stays the same, right? In terms of the fault lines here in the country. But so these resolutions were actually engineered by Jefferson, not explicitly written by Jefferson, that went directly against the constitutional idea of we the people. It said, no, we the states, and therefore, since it's we the states, we can bow out if we don't like something that's passed, and we can nullify. So Leven Powell actually creates a certain amount of national stir by attacking Jefferson directly on this, putting out writings and that are published in newspapers. Newspapers really used to cover this kind of stuff, you know, specific resolutions, specific political activity. It wasn't all gossip and scandal, you know. There was a lot of that too, but you know, they actually covered what was going on. And then in the country basically began to turn more anti-French because the French were being pretty obnoxious at the time. In that wave, more Federalists were elected to Congress, including Leven Powell. I looked very hard to find out what he did when he was there. I haven't found any significant speeches or anything of this sort, but he did serve for 2 years and then retired to his farm. I mean, he was a plantation owner. He did have 22 slaves or something like that. That's where he got his wealth. He had kids who he sent to Kentucky and were involved in colonizing there. But basically he retired to, I've seen reference that he worked to improve agriculture, that he has sort of an experimental farm. And he also worked on that transportation question of trying to be able to improve the efficiency of commerce. And his role as the leading Federalist was taken over by this fellow, Charles Fenton Mercer, founder of Aldie Mill. And he had quite a different trajectory in terms of where, not so much where he came from, but how he was educated and developed and came to his views. He studied at Princeton. I mean, that was basically almost treasonous to some plantation owners down here because, you know, you'd be infected by those northern ideas. But he was there, and then he did a lot of travel in Europe after that. He became a lawyer. That probably told you he was going to go into politics or something. So he also, and then he moved into this area in Virginia. I think he inherited this land, and established Aldie in 1807. It became, it was a major grist mill, major, they called it the biggest manufacturing establishment where in Virginia or just in Loudoun. I think it's actually bigger. Yeah, but major development that he built. And then in 1810, he's elected to the House of Delegates, and he broadens his scope. I mean, you can imagine he had a broad scope. He was at Princeton, he was traveling through Europe and so forth and so on. So he thought, he didn't think, like Jefferson often indicated he did, that his country was Virginia. I mean, his country was the United States. And going to Richmond, he had seen other parts of the United States, and he'd seen what's happening in Virginia relative to it. I mean, there's writings of his just, you know, absolutely mortified with this lack of education in the educational establishments in Virginia, the state of the transportation in Virginia, all because the taxation system, you know, and the political control was among a plantation grouping that didn't want to spend money for that. I mean, why should they spend money for that? So he's elected in 1810, and he starts a whirlwind of activity, really. It is interrupted a bit by the War of 1812. I thought I had to mention that because basically the Federalists in this area, and Federalist leaders in particular, tended to be people who had been in the war, right? As Monroe was in the war, Marshall was in the war, and so forth, as opposed to those who, for whatever reason, being in politics or constitutionally or whatever, were not actually active military. But he was, you know, for a short period of time, although he dealt a lot with the resources question in terms of Virginia's resources. And during the War of 1812, of course, resources were a big problem since the bank had been eliminated. They couldn't borrow, they were borrowing money at exorbitant rates. You know, the infrastructure had not been developed. They couldn't move troops. You know, it would take 3 weeks to get to someplace you need to get there in 3 days, you know, and so forth. So those problems of economic development were very much on the big screen, so to speak. So first thing he moves is literary fund. We still have a literary fund in Virginia. I don't really know a lot about its functioning, but the idea of it was to provide federal support and money to get your basic, your citizens, your normal citizens, educated. And that was his, I mean, the article is from much later, but the concept and the activity existed throughout his entire involvement with this. There's more on this particular aspect of his fight for education in a minute, because he ultimately puts forward a plan that would provide free elementary schools throughout the state. And he runs up against none other than Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wants a priority on educating the Virginia elite at the University of Virginia. And he says, well, okay, you know, yes, you should have wide education, but every county should provide the funds for it. You know, it depends on how they want to tax themselves. It should be a local affair. Don't we don't have to provide support for that. We have to put our emphasis on educating the elite. And so they don't have to go to Europe and they don't have to go to the North. And unfortunately, Mercer loses. And we really don't get public education in Virginia until 1870 because he loses in 1817. He also establishes the Board of Public Works. They set up an arrangement of co-financing so that you could get, if the certain amount given by the local financiers and localities, the state would bump in some money to help develop the roads and canals and other infrastructure. He actually goes on a trip with John Marshall up the James to try to work on a canal that goes, connects these James, and I cannot pronounce this word correctly, Canwa or whatever. So canal. But that doesn't happen because the Virginians don't put the money into it. He's the chair of the banking committee. His major concern there is that he wants that the western counties, and that includes what you think of as West Virginia today, couldn't get credit in an accessible way. They had to, everything was too far distant. They didn't have their own local branch bank. And he tried to expand that access in his activity. And then he's elected to Congress because probably, well, I don't know. I haven't read diaries of anything, so I don't know why he decided he should be in Congress. But what I would anticipate is he figured he couldn't solve this problem on the state level, so he better get where the decisions are really going to be made. And in the 1817 post-war of 1812, there was a tremendous acceleration of organizing around the American system, you know, for building up our manufacturers, for the infrastructure. Even John Calhoun was a big promoter of national support for developing our roads and canal system, connecting the nation, unifying the nation through that kind of commerce. So, so he decided to get elected to Congress, and in an extremely nasty election against a fellow by the name of Mason, lived at Selma, I believe, Selma Plantation. He got elected. The balance of now the congressional districts change over the course of this time. It's not strictly like what it is now, and it's two different configurations actually in his time frame, which is quite substantial. But I think it's Fauquier and Fairfax end up voting for Mason, and Loudoun, but Loudoun gives such a big boost to Mercer that he wins, right? And Mason says, you did it by cheating. You did it by letting those Quakers vote. And those Quakers did not sign the oath of allegiance to something, that was required. Anyway, Congress upheld the election, and Mercer stayed there for quite some time. As you can see, kept being reelected because he was apparently addressing the needs of his constituency. He immediately becomes chair of the House Committee on Roads and Canals, and develops tremendous plans for what could be supported, invested in by the Second National Bank, and so forth. This is just the picture of Ohio. These canals actually did get built in the course of the 1820s and connected the Erie Canal to the Ohio River and were a tremendous boon for the farming and development of these areas. But his biggest passion was the C&O Canal. He loved George. He saw his mission in life as fulfilling what George Washington wanted to do. He said it all the time, over and over again. And that's what he fought for in order to get a federal charter and get a federal funding to help with establish the C&O Canal, because it was by that time had become totally clear you weren't going to be able to clear the Potomac to be able to make clear sailing all the way to the west. So if you've been to the park at Great Falls, you see this nifty little boat called the Charles Mercer. But this was extremely popular here in Loudoun County. There was when they succeeded in getting the funding bill through, there was a major banquet given in Leesburg, with great speeches and, hoopla and so forth and so on. And that's an extremely, and keep in mind, this is the middle of the 1820s. At the same time, Jefferson is saying, this is a terrible thing to have the federal government involved in our local matters, right? What will they do next? He doesn't say it, but other people say, if they can do this, they can free our slaves. So that's He also, speaking of that, very controversially, actually is a leading member of the American Colonization Society. That's obviously quite a mixed bag. Some people wanting it to preserve slavery, other people wanting it to emancipate. But the major thing he did in that regard was to really go after the continuing international slave trade. Because while we banned it in 1808, at the same time the British did, by the way, they didn't do it before. While he was in Congress, he produced a major report on how many slaves were continuing to evade the law and were being brought over. I have not read this report. It would be very valuable to see. And he said, we're just not doing what we need to enforce what's going on here. What we need to do is mandate the death penalty for those who are found continuing this atrocity, in documenting the atrocity of the slave trade itself and so forth. And that did succeed in being passed. I'm not familiar with how effective that was, although I've read that at least one person was hung as a result, one ship captain. But that was another passion of his. And then the last thing that I want to emphasize on his role is really this question of the franchise, which I mentioned before, about how little representation there was for the Western counties, the non-plantation run counties in the House of Delegates. Mercer was responsible in large part for pulling together a convention in 1830 to try to change that, to try to get universal representation based on population, not on wealth, right? Which is how they did it. It didn't succeed. I think they made a deal where Loudoun got a couple more representatives. Some of the counties in the west, further west, got a couple more. But that also was a losing battle, but a battle that actually was very worthy of the ideals that he was fighting for. And you know what, I include this because of comments that were made to me after I wrote the article on this subject I am concluding on, by Taylor Chamberlain, who's written on the Civil War. And his view was that it was very interesting to look at Loudoun, the Federalist interest in strength in Loudoun, from the standpoint of the fact that this part, particularly this northern part of the county, was so much more oriented to the Union than the rest. And this will give you, so there's some overlap with those who were Federalists and those who were against secession. I mean, one of the strongholds on the Federalist side also, interestingly enough, was over there in the what do you call it? When you go across the Bay Bridge, the bridge down there, the Eastern Shore. That was a stronghold for the Federalists, as were the cities. And you see the city areas, and you see this northern area. It maps, right? Which is not to say, as you can certainly see by Leven Powell, that all the Federalists were anti-slavery or didn't have slaves. A lot of them did, but their base of support, their orientation, was in a direction that appealed to those who didn't want a slave-based economy. And many of them were not oriented strictly to a slave-based economy, but to more of a commercial manufacturing-based economy. So it's a matter of further study and of some interest. And for a deeper look, I hope you'll look at the book. And I also just always include this. I'm available for questions by email. The blog regularly updates historical issues with a view to how they might be useful for the problems today. And that is what I would conclude with. Thank you very much.